Okay, now our next speaker is Dr. Mel Farrell. Mel is the director of the Irish Humanities Alliance in the Royal Irish Academy. He's a native of Ardagh, County Longford, and a graduate of Maynooth. He lectures in South African history and Irish history in the School of History in UCD. And previously he lectured in St. Patrick's College in Drumcondra. He is the author of the recently published book, 2017, in fact, Party Politics in a New Democracy, the Irish Free State, 1922 to 1937, and that was published by Palgrave. He has also authored 5 peer-review articles in journals including Parliamentary History, Era Ireland, and the New Hibernia Review, and also 2 book chapters. He was also the joint editor with Ciara Meehan and Jason Kinnerk of A Formative Decade, Ireland in the 1920s, which was published by Irish Academic Press in 2015. So Mel will speak on Longford 1920, the politics of guerrilla war, and I'll hand you over now to Mel.
Thank you very much, Martin. Just in the last 10 minutes, my network connection just dropped slightly. So if it does again, I might just have to turn off the camera. Can you see the slides, Martin?
Yes, indeed, we can indeed. Yes, yeah.
Just okay. So thank you very much, Martin, for the invitation, first of all, and also for the very generous introduction. When Martin approached me a couple of months ago in relation to the conference, he suggested that I look at the politics of 1920 in Ireland. And of course, this is about my 5th paper in this decade of commemoration in regards to County Longford. And in previous talks, I've looked at a Home Rule movement that stood on the cusp of its greatest achievement in 1914, on the eve of the Great War, only to be swept aside in the Sinn Féin tide 4 years later. I also looked at the pivotal May 1917 South Longford by-election, which placed this county at the vanguard of the more advanced nationalism sweeping the country. I also looked at the 1918 general election, in which a greatly expanded Irish electorate, up from 698,000 to over 1.93 million, revolutionised Irish politics by inflicting a brutal defeat on the old Irish party, while Sinn Féin won 73 of Ireland's 106 seats in the British Parliament. Of course, the Irish party were reduced to 6 seats on that occasion. And finally, of course, I also looked last year at the first meeting of the Dáil and its significance in the context of the wider Irish Revolution. Which brings me to today's talk, and there will of course be some overlap. And of course, when looking at the politics of 1920, the obvious topic would be the local government elections, which occurred in January and June of 1920. However, as I sat down to write this talk, it occurred to me that it was clear that a narrow focus on the 1920 elections would not come close to doing justice to how intrinsically linked politics were, both in terms of the international dimension of this phase of the Irish Revolution, but also in terms of the IRA's guerrilla campaign as it manifested during 1920. Something had clearly gone awry by 1920 with Ireland in the midst of a guerrilla war. During the years 1917 to 1919, Sinn Féin argued that there was a political path to Irish independence. Of course, some individuals within the independence movement had always intended that there would be a return to warfare when conditions allowed. Sinn Féin had contested 4 by-elections in 1917 and had won all 4. North Roscommon in February, South Longford in May, Clare in July, and Kilkenny Borough in August. Moreover, the final phases of the First World War also pointed to a political resolution. The United States had entered the war in April 1917 to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. And in January 1918, President Woodrow Wilson gave hope to nationalists all across the globe by outlining his 14 points for peace, which were based on the principle of national self-determination. And it is in this context that the tone of politics in nationalist Ireland shifted decisively away from the old language of party politics at Westminster and limited devolved powers in the form of Home Rule towards the international environment of national self-determination and sovereignty as articulated by President Wilson. Indeed, after it was reconstituted as a Republican party during the October 1917 Ardèche, Sinn Féin made the acquisition of international recognition for the Republican cause one of its key aims. Throughout 1918, the party made representation of Ireland's case at the post-war peace conference a central component of its strategy, and this was taken on by the first Dáil from January 1919, as exemplified in the four important documents that asserted Ireland's independence and its place in the post-war world. These were, of course, the Constitution of Dáil Éireann, which gave the Dáil legislative powers and provided for the election of a government, the Declaration of Independence, by which the Dáil affirmed retrospectively the Proclamation of 1916 and the Declaration of Irish Independence. Thirdly, the Message to the Free Nations of the World, which asserted in French, English and Irish that, quote, the nation of Ireland, having proclaimed her national independence, calls through her elected representatives in Parliament, assembled in the Irish capital on January 21st, 1919, upon every free nation to support the Irish Republic by recognising Ireland's national status and her right to its vindication at the peace conference. Such was Sinn Féin's faith in the global climate of the day, and especially the Paris Peace Conference, that many did believe that there would be no need for any further armed resistance. Ireland's case would be settled in Paris. However, as we know, that most certainly was not the case. By the autumn of 1920, when the War of Independence was about to enter its bloodiest phase, as we've heard from Mary earlier this morning, Ireland was at war. The Dáil was scarcely able to meet after being banned by the British authorities in September 1919, and more ominously, thousands of men in strange uniforms that were anything but uniform were pouring into the country to bolster the beleaguered RIC and make Ireland a hell for rebels. To quote Arthur Mitchell, faced with the loss of her first colony, Britannia bared her teeth. And looking at the politics of 1920, my paper today will focus on how the volunteers moved from a defensive posture to a more offensive one in late 1919 and into 1920. How the 1920 local elections put Sinn Féin in control of local as well as national politics. How the British lost the propaganda war, and finally the futility of the Government of Ireland Bill, as it became inevitable that David Lloyd George's government would have to negotiate with Sinn Féin on the terms of Ireland's independence. While the end of the First World War brought to an end and resolved many of Central and Eastern Europe's national questions, the Irish question remained as intractable as it had been on the outbreak of the war 4 years earlier. Amidst the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian, German and Russian empires, a range of national groups had moved rapidly to advance their claims to independence, seizing on that Wilsonian moment that Erez Manela has written about. Czechoslovakia, Finland, the Baltic states and Poland, and of course Yugoslavia, were among the new nation states to emerge in Europe at the end of the First World War. Ireland, of course, was an exception, seeking its independence from the United Kingdom a victorious power in that war. And in December 1918, Sinn Féin's election manifesto was shaped by that wider international context. Whereas the Irish Parliamentary Party's Home Rule proposal was framed by British politics and petitioning the British government at Westminster, Sinn Féin's focus since 1917 was on the language of self-determination, recognition at the Paris Peace Conference, and commitment to achieving an Irish Republic. Its manifesto demanded the withdrawal of all Irish representatives from the Parliament at Westminster and pledged to establish, quote, a constituent assembly comprising persons chosen by Irish constituencies, which could then, quote, speak and act in the name of the Irish people. The party's manifesto was new and of its time, whereas the Irish Parliamentary Party seemed to be stuck in the old politics of petitioning the British government. It was clear in late 1918 to many sitting members of Parliament who represented the Irish Party that the writing was on the wall. Many concluded that they were fighting a losing battle and withdrew from public life. Of the 68 Irish Party MPs who held seats at the dissolution of Parliament, 32 chose not to go forward. Moreover, the Labour Party, which would have benefited from the increased number of young, labouring and working class voters enfranchised in 1918, decided not to contest that year's general election so that the national question might be resolved. And if this, of course, was a major boost for Sinn Féin, with some of the party's strategists estimating that the trades union participation in the election could have cost it as many as 15 seats. Of course, outgoing North Longford MP, J.P. Farrell, who was, of course, the founder and editor of the Longford Leader, and as you can see on this slide, Farrell was not shy about using the Longford Leader to promote his own political campaigns. He had no intention of stepping down and instead took the fight to Sinn Féin and the outgoing South Longford MP, Joseph McGuinness. During that election, J.P. Farrell came out strongly against, quote, the madness and folly and stupidity of some of the younger people, arguing that they risked leaving Ireland bound and gagged at the feet of England. And of course, also during this campaign, the Irish Party reminded the voters that they had achieved significant land reform through parliamentary agitation, and that by engaging in revolutionary politics, there was a risk of a 20th century wave of confiscations of land, which of course was an attempt to rally more conservative voters behind the Irish Parliamentary Party. However, with so many younger men and women over 30 newly enfranchised and eligible to vote for the first time, this message was symptomatic of a party that was heading for extinction. A Sinn Féin victory was never in any doubt, with Farrell polling 4,173 votes to McGuinness's 11,122, and this margin was in line with the trend all across nationalist Ireland. And I think it's worth mentioning at this point that the December 1918 general election revealed that the British and Irish electorates were moving in opposite directions. They were moving further away from each other. The British electoral map was turning blue, swinging behind the Conservative Party after the victory in the First World War. And of course, the Irish map, in switching behind Sinn Féin, was turning a deeper shade of green. Therefore, the prospect of a political settlement of the Irish question was probably worse than it had been for about a generation. For a start, Britain now had other priorities, reshaping the post-war order among them, while the changes in Irish politics since the Easter Rising meant that a settlement based on Home Rule would no longer wash with the Irish electorate. The platform of the Home Rule Party, of course, at the beginning of the decade was designed in such a way as to appeal to British liberals. And as the undisputed representatives of Irish nationalism in 1910, the Home Rule Party had entered into a formal alliance with the Liberal government of H.H. Asquith, supporting him as Prime Minister in return for a new Home Rule Bill. However, in the December 1918 election, it wasn't just the Irish Party that was on the way out. The British Liberal Party was also on the wane. The election saw the Conservative Party gain over 100 seats in what was a landslide victory for the wartime coalition government led by Liberal Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And I hope this rather crude image, which I've obtained courtesy of Wikipedia Commons, helps to underline the sweeping victory won by David Lloyd George's coalition in December 1918. And in fact, such was the scale of the victory that Sinn Féin's 73 seats left them as the largest party in opposition to the government. And of course, Sinn Féin did not take their seats in Parliament. So it was a very weak opposition to a government that had won 71% of the seats in Parliament. They actually needed 354 seats for a majority in the House of Commons. And in fact, between them, the Lloyd George Liberals and the Tories won 506 seats. So its composition and the strength of the majority that it enjoyed ensured that this would not be a government inclined to sympathy with Irish nationalism. So while the 1910s began with an alliance of Irish nationalists and British liberals, it ended with Irish and British politics as far apart as they had been for many decades. And of course, when the Tories succeeded in ousting Lloyd George as Prime Minister in October 1922, there has not been a Liberal Prime Minister in the 98 years since. So after its comprehensive defeat of the Irish Party in the election, on the 21st of January 1919, Sinn Féin's elected representatives met in the Mansion House as the first Dáil and declared Ireland's independence from Great Britain. The staging of this meeting was, in many respects, the political equivalent of the Easter Rising of 1916, and every effort was made to attract attention to the proceedings, with journalists, especially those working for foreign newspapers, given some of the best seats from which to observe the proceedings. The Paris Peace Conference had commenced on the 12th of January 1919, and it was hoped that the existence of the Dáil would help Sinn Féin delegates by bestowing some form of formal official recognition and thereby increase their chances of success. And of course, the image on the slide is from the Daily Graphic newspaper, which was a rival to the popular Illustrated London News. But this formal opening of the first Dáil Éireann marked the pinnacle of the Sinn Féin movement's achievements in the period since the Easter Rising. In contrast with the petition-style politics of the Irish Party, Sinn Féin's founder Arthur Griffith had long argued that only by abstaining from Westminster could Irish nationalists force the British government to meet with Ireland's political representatives to negotiate the terms on which Ireland could achieve its independence. However, as we've heard in Mary's excellent paper earlier this morning, the first Dáil's term would in fact be marked by a war of independence. We even date the beginning of the war to the 21st of January, the same day as that first Dáil meeting, and the attack on an RIC patrol at Soloheadbeg in County Tipperary. And of course, the final meeting of the first Dáil took place on the 10th of May 1921, and May 1921 would be one of the most violent months of that conflict before the truce of July the 11th. Furthermore, most of the Dáil's activity occurred during 1919. The Dáil and other nationalist bodies, including the Sinn Féin Party, were banned by the British authorities in September 1919. The British could not hope to reassert their authority in Ireland so long as a rival administration was tolerated. From September 1919, the Dáil operated as an underground body, meeting infrequently and with great difficulty. As a consequence, its meeting on the 9th of May 1919 was the last occasion in which the first Dáil was able to assemble in public session. Thereafter, the Dáil and its government acted as a clandestine parliament and administration. And the first Dáil, while it met 21 times in total, only 8 of these meetings occurred between September 1919 and May 1921. And of course, it's worth pointing out as well that the work of Sinn Féin activism, and this of course is relevant to the 1920 local elections, also became difficult after the party was prohibited. No Ordét could take place while the party was banned, and any open meetings that took place were, as Michael Laffin points out, lightning meetings that could disperse before the police could intervene. Which brings us to how we come to open guerrilla warfare by 1920. The prescription of the Dáil in September 1919 was one of a number of setbacks for those who hoped that politics might deliver a sovereign, self-governed Ireland. And of course, I'm delighted that Barney Sexton in his question mentioned the many shades of green, because there were many shades of green at play at this time. First came the disappointment of the post-war peace conference. While the Allied powers were happy to support the establishment of new nation states in the former territories of the defeated powers, Ireland's case was seen as a matter for Great Britain to consider. To force the matter would, of course, from a French and American perspective, risk damaging relations with the British government. American President Woodrow Wilson went so far as to describe the Irish question as a domestic British problem in which he could not intervene. And of course, this was a major blow for the Sinn Féin party, which had invested so much in the Paris Peace Conference. So once it became clear that there would be no recognition in Paris, the Sinn Féin leader, Eamon de Valera, switched his attention to the United States of America. He departed for the US in June 1919, at a time when there was already a slow but steady increase in violence in Ireland, despite the overall defensive posture of the Irish volunteers at that time. When de Valera returned to Ireland 18 months later, the country, of course, was waging guerrilla war on the British Crown forces. So by the autumn of 1919, we see that politics has been pushed to the sidelines. Within the independence movement, there was an opportunity now for those of a militarist persuasion to seize the initiative. And because it was clear to them that politics could only achieve so much. And before long, the volunteers adopted a more aggressive posture, taking the fight to the British authorities, to the British forces. Already, on the 10th of April 1919, the Dáil had authorised a boycott of the Royal Irish Constabulary, which undermined the British state's first line of defence in Ireland. Soon, a combination of this boycott, social ostracism, and sustained IRA attacks left the RIC virtually incapable of pursuing its normal policing functions. Morale within the force reached an all-time low, and the rate of resignations increased at the same time as there was a dramatic decline in recruitment to the force. Of course, there were some RIC men who sympathised with the independence movement and began working for the IRA in terms of acting as double agents. And for others, of course, they made the calculation to stick with the RIC through the War of Independence. And of course, the RIC pension was a very attractive reason for sticking with the force. I should say as well that Sinn Féin branches were encouraged to cooperate in helping to find employment for RIC men who had resigned their positions. Describing the War of Independence in 1919, Michael Hopkinson said, quote, "The extremely limited and episodic nature of the hostilities scarcely merits the term war. However," he goes on to say, that from the moment that the IRA began to attack barracks RIC barracks in January 1920, it was clear that something more akin to a full-scale insurrection was taking place. The staggering rate of resignations sapped the strength of the RIC, and this would accelerate in 1920. However, by now the volunteers, now increasingly referred to as the Irish Republican Army, were on the offensive against the police force. The apparent failure of the Dáil's political initiatives had convinced many volunteers that they had to go on the offensive. It was, however, March 1921 before the Dáil formally confirmed that it accepted responsibility for the actions of the IRA. A combination of resignations and IRA attacks forced the police to retreat from the smaller, isolated positions so as to concentrate their forces in the larger, more easily defensible barracks in the larger towns. Approximately 500 RIC positions were evacuated, and this retreat was a symbolic victory for the IRA and underlined the extent to which British authority was disintegrating. On the 6th of January, as we've heard, County Longford became one of the first counties to stage a GHQ-approved attack on an RIC barracks. However, the attempted capture of Drumlish RIC barracks on the 6th of January, sorry, just bear with me here for a second. However, the attempted capture of Drumlish RIC barracks eventually led to its abandonment by the RIC. I should say as well that on Easter 1920, to mark the 4th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, GHQ authorised a coordinated arson attack on evacuated RIC barracks, courthouses and local tax offices. Some 350 buildings, about 300 of them RIC barracks, were destroyed on this single weekend. And as you can see on the slide, this is how the attack was reported in the Evening Herald on the 5th of April 1920. And just as in our own time, the earliest reports were often the ones that were least accurate in 1920. By the end of 1920, 533 RIC barracks were destroyed by the IRA, 23 of them being occupied at the time that they were attacked by the IRA. By August 1920, a time when 50 RIC constables were leaving the force every week, and County Kildare's quota of police barracks had been reduced from 24 to 6, while West Galway's fell from 60 to 20. At the beginning of 1919, there were 17 occupied RIC barracks in County Longford. 2 years later, in January 1921, only 4 RIC barracks remained open in the county. So you can see the dramatic evaporation, essentially, of this first line of defence of the British authorities in Ireland. Meanwhile, the British prepared their counterattack. In late 1919, the government made the fateful decision to augment the demoralised RIC by recruiting what would become known as the Blackened Hands. And as we've heard from Mary, the attractive wage was attractive to those veterans of the First World War who found themselves out of work in the depressed post-war economy in Britain. In January 1920, adverts were placed in British newspapers for men willing to face, quote, a rough and dangerous task. About 100 Blackened Hands were recruited each month from January 1920 to June 1920, before there was a dramatic increase in recruitment in the autumn of 1920. So this brings us to the local government elections of 1920. While Sinn Féin had won control of national politics in December 1918, at the beginning of 1920, local government in Ireland was still controlled by the old Home Rule Party, by the old Irish Parliamentary Party machine. The local elections of January and June 1920, with cities and towns going to the polls in January, and rural districts and county councils voting in June were seized upon as an opportunity to blunt the political success of Sinn Féin. Following the bankruptcy of Sligo Corporation, the 1918 Sligo Corporation Act was introduced, which legislated for a one-off election for this Sligo borough using the proportional representation system of voting. Although the Sligo borough election took place 1 month after Sinn Féin's landslide in the December 1918 election, the party was beaten into second place behind the Sligo ratepayers. Hoping for a nationwide repeat of the Sligo borough election, Lloyd George's government decided to apply proportional representation to the whole of Ireland. This measure was an attempt to dilute Sinn Féin's vote, something that was not unique to Britain at this time, I should say. Other European countries at this time had introduced proportional representation in an effort to curb the growth of left-wing parties. The first PR election in Ireland proved a watershed and of course has been adopted since the foundation of the Irish state, to the delight of amateur psephologists all over Ireland. However, in 1920, this was a rather controversial measure, and while the authorities trained returning officers in the intricacies of the new voting system, it was left to the parties themselves and the Proportional Representation Society to educate the voters. Model elections were held in many towns, and some 125,000 leaflets were distributed, while the Sinn Féin party used its own structures to train its own voters in how to vote. Intriguingly, the Longford Leader seemed much more positive about the new voting system than the Anglo-Celt in Cavan. The leader seemed to think that the new voting system would ensure that votes shall not be wasted. And whereas our old friend X has disappeared, the voter can now use his preferences to keep out those he dislikes most. And as you can see on the slide, the Longford Leader also carried if you like, the Society's educational guide to proportional representation in its issue on the 10th of January 1920. And on the 26th of April 1920, there was a lecture on proportional representation took place in the courthouse in Longford Town, and this was organised by the local government board. Polling for the urban elections took place on the 15th of January. Nationally, Sinn Féin polled 27% and 550 of the 1,806 urban seats contested across the island of Ireland. In Longford, Sinn Féin won 1/3 of the seats on the town's urban district council, 5 out of 15. 5 seats were also won by the Ratepayers Association, 2 seats were won by Labour, 2 ex-soldiers were elected, and 1 independent, Charles McKenna. This result reflects the extent to which Longford Town remained an Irish party heartland as late as 1920. Longford Town was still a garrison town with 2 army barracks, economically reliant on the British presence. It was also the base of the Farrell family, though CJP Farrell was now the family's standard bearer in local politics. The votes of Labour and Charles McKenna saw Sinn Féin's Frank McGuinness elected as chairperson of the county council, with Sinn Féin's Michael Connolly elected vice chair. In Granard, which had always been more fertile ground for Sinn Féin, the party fared better, winning 4 of the 9 seats on offer. And again, Labour votes helped Sinn Féin's Thomas Doherty become elected chair of the council in Granard. Reflecting on Ireland's experiment with proportional representation, the Longford Leader remarked on the 24th of January, quote, "The result could not be more satisfying. Voting had produced a council which fairly and fully, we believe, represents all shades of thought in the town. By contrast, that day's Anglo-Celt in Cavan, under a heading entitled Defects of PR, carried a detailed analysis of how proportional representation had worked in Cavan, and they even returned to the topic of criticism on the 21st of February. As Mary points out in her book, the situation in Ireland changed dramatically between the January urban council elections and those held in June for council and rural district councils, for county and rural district councils across the island. By June, the country was more obviously in a state of war, and press censorship was also more extensive. The June 1920 elections took place while the RIC were at their lowest ebb, and IRA influence was at its height. The June 1920 elections were a Sinn Féin landslide, although many of the seats were uncontested, owing to a mixture of the difficult circumstances of guerrilla war and a degree of pressure applied by the Sinn Féin party to its opponents. The party swept the boards in Connacht and Munster, where, according to Michael Laffin, every single county council member was a member of Sinn Féin or the Labour Party. In Longford, most seats were uncontested in June 1920, and all 20 seats on the county council were won by Sinn Féiners. Frank McGuinness was elected chair of Longford County Council. As Marie shows in her book, in his monthly report, the RIC County Inspector for Longford remarked in June 1920, quote, "The councils in this county are now in the hands of the rabble." Many of those elected were, of course, actively engaged at the front line of the IRA's military campaign, and subsequently Sean McKeown was co-opted onto Longford County Council. This capture of local government represented a major advance for the independence movement. At home and abroad, the results of the 1920 local elections were used as evidence to support the claim that the Dáil was the legitimate government of Ireland. However, the Dáil and the British authorities now struggled for control of Ireland's local administration. W.T. Cosgrave's Dáil Department of Local Government had investigated the possibility of running local government without British grants. It was clear from their analysis that cuts would have to be made to make up the anticipated 15% reduction in revenue to local government. By autumn, the Dáil had resolved to urge all councils to sever their commitment to Dublin Castle's local government board. The vast majority of councils, and of course Sinn Féin controlled 27 out of the 33 county councils in Ireland, Tipperary, North and South having their own county councils. So those councils controlled by Sinn Féin complied with the Dáil's decree, endorsing the Dáil as the elected government of the Irish people. The Longford Urban Council had in fact passed this resolution in March 1920, and subsequently in the summer it was adopted by the County Council in Longford. And of course, as we heard in Marie's talk, civilians often got caught in the crossfire between the British Crown Forces and the IRA. And of course, I just want to mention here that the rate collectors found themselves, and of course local county officials also found themselves in a difficult position in 1920. And of course, many of the ratepayers waited to see which side would come out on top before they made sure that they would try and come down on the right side. In July 1920, the British raised a further counterinsurgency force, this time composed of toughened ex-army officers, and this of course went on to become the RIC Auxiliary Division. The Auxies, as they were colloquially referred to, were heavily armed, highly mobile, and their job was to hunt down the IRA and break the Dáil's resolve. And as we've heard from Marie, in late 1920, M Company Auxiliary Division were recruited and, of course, were subsequently posted to Longford, where they were ambushed at Clonfin on the 2nd of February 1921. But I just have a slide here which I think is quite important, because we often talk about the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries and the difference between them. But I just want to show you that as far as I can make out, I think Black and Tan, by the people who lived through the War of Independence, was kind of adopted as a blanket term for the new recruits to the RIC. So as you can see on this, the Irish Independent is talking about the auxiliary division of the RIC, and claims that they can also be named black and tans on account of their uniforms. Because both the black and tans and the auxiliaries both kind of wore a mixed uniform. So I just wanted to make that point. And I just want to talk a little bit here as well about newspapers, because the staunchly Republican Athlone-based Westmeath Independent had this to say on the 31st of July 1920 about the RIC as it was changing. It is an Irish service no longer. It is being daily recruited from England. The Irishmen in the service feel the change. They remain only until they can get out. And of course, there was an outbreak of violence in Moat and Athlone in the autumn of 1920. And after the arrival of an auxiliary company in October of 1920, and I just have this is an excellent image of a group of auxiliaries which I've taken from the National Library of Ireland's Creative Commons Flickr account. I think it's a very evocative image of a group of auxiliaries on O'Connell Street, I believe. But after the arrival of an auxiliary company in Athlone in October 1920, on the night of the 22nd of October, there was an attempted ambush of a convoy of black and tans near Moat in County Westmeath. And after the ambush, the party of auxiliaries went on the rampage, firing indiscriminately through the streets of Moat and Athlone as a reprisal for the ambush. The auxiliaries' reprisal spree resulted in the death of an innocent civilian, Michael Burke, who was aged 51. The Westmeath Independent would not be bullied and issued another hard-hitting editorial promising that it would continue to reflect, quote, the opinions held by over 90% of the people of this area over which it circulates. There had been attempts by the Crown forces to put pressure on the Westmeath Independent to moderate its editorial line. So after this particular issue of the Westmeath Independent on the 23rd of October, at approximately 3:30 a.m. on the 3rd of November 1920, a mixed force of auxiliaries and black and tans burned down the Athlone printing works and the Westmeath Independent offices. The paper and the printing works employed at least 100 individuals and would not resume publication until February 1922. And of course, there was a dramatic increase in recruitment to the black and tans and the auxiliaries from this time in September 1920. And of course, it was the sack of Balbriggan in September that brought the black and tans their notoriety. And I just have a slide here which depicts, we've heard about the burning of Granard already, but just to point out that the Temperance Hall in Longford Town was also burned by Crown forces at this time. This is the Longford Leader's front page on the 6th of November 1920. Just in the final few moments of the talk, I just want to talk a little bit about propaganda, because you might ask, what does all this talk about the Crown forces and the guerrilla warfare have to do with the politics of the situation? Well, in terms of finding a settlement, it had everything to do with politics, because the ill discipline of the black and tans and the auxiliaries, combined with the reprisals, both official and unofficial, ensured that the British lost the propaganda war. Since it commenced publication on the 11th of November 1919, the Irish Bulletin, which was the official organ of the Dáil and produced by its publicity department, had worked diligently to bring news of Ireland's war to international attention. It was impressive, therefore, that the Bulletin had excerpts published in influential newspapers such as the Times of London and became popular in countries such as India and Egypt. And of course, Dáil, had representatives across the globe in Europe, parts of North and South America, Asia, and parts of Africa. So there was a concerted attempt really to counter the official narrative emanating from Dublin Castle. And of course, Britain was the world power in 1920, so their press agencies, their influence had immense reach. So it was very important from the Dáil's perspective that there was a narrative that challenged that official story being put out by Dublin Castle. The conduct of the Black and Tans and auxiliaries was of great benefit in terms of Republican propaganda. The misconduct of the Crown forces became the prominent theme during late 1920 as the conflict escalated. This allowed the Dáil portray Britain as the aggressor and the volunteers as a defensive body that had been provoked by the Crown forces. It was not unusual as well at this time to see the conduct of the British Crown forces equated with the excesses of the German forces in Belgium during the First World War, which of course had been a particularly emotive at the beginning of World War I. I just want to say as well that these matters were also discussed in the House of Commons at Westminster. There was a debate on the 20th of October during which several speakers spoke out about the conduct of the Crown forces in Ireland, with the MP for Hull Central, Joseph Kenworthy, going so far as to say, if we do not protest against this system of terrorism, which the Chief Secretary haltingly defends, and the British Prime Minister and Secretary of State for War boast of, we shall be guilty before the eyes of the world of adopting exactly the same spirit that they, the Germans, adopted in Belgium. And I should say as well that the destruction of the Westmeath Independent and Athlone printing works by Crown forces also came up in the House of Commons in November 1920. But I just see that I'm rapidly running out of time, so I'll try to move on to the conclusion. On the eve of the First World War, it had looked as though Ireland was on the cusp of Home Rule. However, the campaign for a constitutional settlement had faltered on the reluctance of many within the British establishment to accept a separate Irish political identity. And of course, the intense counter-campaign that was organised by the Ulster Unionists. On the nationalist side, there was a clear drift towards separatist politics after the Easter Rising, as shown in the 4 by-elections of 1917, the December 1918 general election, and the 2 sets of local elections held in 1920. Once nationalist Ireland set its sights on full independence, it was inevitable that there would be some form of military showdown with the British. Politics in the context of 1919, 1920, and 1921 would only go so far. As Michael Hopkinson observed, it was inconceivable that Britain would withdraw from Ireland, its oldest possession, as a consequence of the Dáil's existence or international pressure. Between 1919 and the Truce of July 1921, a combination of 4 methods brought Lloyd George to the negotiating table. Open political activity in the form of open political organisation and contesting elections, undermining of the existing British state structures in Ireland through the police, the Dáil courts, the Dáil itself, the establishment of an alternative counter-state, and of course, finally, physical force, and ultimately by the autumn of 1920, full-scale guerrilla warfare. And it should be pointed out as well that no guerrilla campaign of this scale could be sustained without the support of a large section of the population. And this is one of the differences between the War of Independence and the Civil War. Arthur Griffith, a lifelong pacifist who was deeply uncomfortable with the IRA campaign during the War of Independence, had long argued that Irish nationalists could only claim a right to national self-determination by abstaining from the British Parliament, forming a National Assembly in Dublin, and forcing London to recognise that they must negotiate the terms of Ireland's independence. However, without the use of force, as Ronan Fanning has argued, there is not a shred of evidence that Lloyd George's Tory-dominated government would have moved from the 1914-style niggardliness of the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 to the larger, if imperfect, generosity of the treaty. And as was referenced by Councillor Paul Ross at the beginning of today's conference, this is a difficult question that will have to be grappled as we approach the state's centenary in 2022. Lloyd George's first attempt at a solution, the Government of Ireland Act 1920, was unworkable. Any form of settlement along the lines of Home Rule no longer appealed in nationalist Ireland. Sinn Féin had established a Dáil, declared independence, and approved the volunteers' actions to defend it. Instead, the independence movement held out for full sovereignty, and while we will no doubt examine the minutiae of the Anglo-Irish Treaty and how it came to be negotiated this time next year as we approach the centenary of the treaty and the foundation of the state, we can say that in 1922 an Irish state was established, taking its place alongside Austria, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Hungary, the Baltic states, Poland and Yugoslavia. However, Irish statehood in 1922 was unique in that it was achieved in the face of the determined opposition of a great power that had been victorious in the world in the First World War. However, as I hope this paper has shown, the faces of that determined opposition, the blackened hands and the auxiliaries, caused Britain to lose face in Ireland, Britain and further afield. Thank you very much.